When I fled Westeros, I washed up where most disgraced knights do. The Golden Company. The best of the Eastern Sellsword companies for what that's worth. 20,000 battle-hardened men, horses, and even elephants, ready to kill their employers' enemies, no matter the cause, no matter the result. The Golden Company began as revenge. On his deathbed, a Targaryen king legitimized all his bastards, either to buy his way into the Seven Heavens or spite the family left behind. As everyone knew would happen, his great bastards weren't satisfied with their father's name and wanted his throne as well, under the banner of the new House Blackfyre. Their true-born brothers disagreed. When the Blackfyres lost the Civil War, they fled to Essos to gather a new army in return for what was theirs. But wars cost money, and Aegor Rivers, the leader of the Blackfyre forces who now called himself Bittersteel, decided he could sell his army's services to other lords while waiting to return to Westeros. The Golden Company was born. For their words, they chose, beneath the gold, the bitter steel, to remind themselves that they weren't just hired killers, but knights of Westeros who'd one day retake their home. They never tried, because they were too successful as sellswords. When Qohor declined to pay the new Golden Company for its services, Bittersteel dared what even the Dothraki failed to do and sacked the city. After filling the company's coffers, he declared that unlike all other sellswords, the Golden Company would never break a contract. So they haven't. But they also don't take contracts unless the odds are heavily in their favor. Cowardly, perhaps, but far from foolish. Quite a few wars have ended with one side learning the Golden Company agreed to fight on the other. Though it's not just their reputation that scares off would-be enemies. For some, it only takes one look at the captain's war tent surrounded by the gilded skulls of former captains, many splintered with the wounds that killed them. Any sellswords who'd waste that much gold must have a lot of it, and nobody pays in defeat. Could the Golden Company ever take Westeros? They get more practice fighting than the average knight, and their elephants could make a mess on a battlefield. But men who fight for gold will never fight as hard as men who fight for home. I should know. I've done one. Now I do the other.
The Citadel of Oldtown is the greatest centre of learning in the world. Not that it has much competition, really. Most lords think of books the way they think of younger sons. Useful to have around, as long as they keep to the corners. Back when House Hightower still ruled Oldtown as kings, a crippled younger son sought solace in books and those who wrote them, and became the greatest patron of learning in his day. Scholars of all sorts flocked to Oldtown to debate and write and debate. After this Prince Peremore's death, his brother granted land to Peremore's pets, as the wise men were called, though now they're known as maesters. Like the Night's Watch, the Citadel accepts any boy into its halls, be he a lordling, peasant or bastard. Merit, not birth, determines advancement. Once a novice proves adept in a field, he forges a chain link that signifies his skill. Black iron is for ravenry, gold for sums and accounts, silver for healing, iron for warfare, Valyrian steel for the higher mysteries. Magic, though nobody likes to say the word in the Citadel, or explain how dragons fly or dead men walk. Once an acolyte has forged enough links to make a chain, he becomes a maester. Should he continue his studies, he might rise to archmaester and be given a ring, rod and mask forged from the appropriate metal for his chosen field. The wisest, or most ambitious of the archmaesters might even be called to serve as a grand maester on the small council, responsible for steering the king and the realm, as well as keeping the Citadel informed of everything. The heart of the Citadel is the library, which contains tomes from all over the world on every subject imaginable, from the trivial to the essential to the restricted. If the world ended tomorrow, we could rebuild it with the knowledge contained in these books. Theoretically. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But as every novice learns, the Citadel is more than a building, more than a library, more than the Order of Maesters. It is an idea that we may know the world. Not completely, not in any one man's lifetime, but piece by piece, with each generation building upon the knowledge of their predecessors where they can, and preserving it where they can't. And, unfortunately for us all, forgetting it when they shouldn't. The Maesters don't believe in prophecy, with good reason. The Children of the Forest supposedly could see into the future, yet were surprised by the First Men who nearly ended their race, and the Long Night, which nearly ended us all. Some Maesters posit that the children's magical sight was invented long after they vanished from Westeros, by singers hoping to thrill peasant girls. Not that most Maesters have much experience in what does or doesn't do that. When Aegon the Conqueror came to the Iron Islands, the priest King Lodos claimed his divine father, the Ironborn's drowned god, had shown him krakens pulling Aegon's ships into the deep. No krakens ever arrived, and even if they had, they wouldn't have stopped Aegon and his dragons without wings of their own. Confused, Lodos filled his pockets with stones and walked into the sea to take counsel with his father. Thousands followed him, but apparently the drowned god didn't appreciate a crowd. Their corpses washed upon the Iron Islands for years. According to legend, House Targaryen survived the doom of Valyria thanks to Daenys the Dreamer, who foresaw the calamity and convinced her father to flee their homeland. It could be true. The Targaryens were always a bit more. But as Maester Yendel points out, in the east the Targaryens were one of 1,000 minor noble families, and in Westeros they became kings. Politics, not prophecy, could have drawn them to our shores. Politics can also explain the prophecies of Daemon Blackfyre II, a Targaryen bastard rumoured to possess the family gift. While posing as a hedge knight, he told a future Lord Commander of the Kingsguard that he dreamt of a dragon hatching at White Walls Castle, and took it as a sign that he'd win the Iron Throne. Perhaps if he'd slept a bit longer, he'd have dreamt of the King's Hand putting down his rebellion a day later, before it even began. Most Maesters dismiss all Targaryen claims of prophecy as mystic nonsense, a relic of their Eastern ancestry. To be fair, across the Narrow Sea there isn't a market without a warlock from Qarth telling fortunes or a shadowbinder from Ashai reading fates in blood. Or so I hear, from the Maesters. But when I was a boy, I overheard the cook whispering to a maid about a woods witch camping outside Horn Hill who was called Maggie the Frog. Now I realise it was probably a corruption of the Eastern word for wizards, Magi. One day my father rode out hunting, though no game was in season, and whatever power she had likely didn't save her. Even the wisest Maesters, however, have no answer for the Red Priests who prophesy about the return of the Long Night. For thousands of years, they've kept watch for the return of the prince who was promised, who will be born amid salt and smoke to drive off the darkness once again. Prince of what realm, promised by whom and to whom? The prophecy doesn't say, but at the very least it confirms that not even Essos escaped the Long Night. I imagine the Cataclysm must have confused the East. Unlike Westeros, they wouldn't have known of the Night King, or the White Walkers, or the war waged by the First Men and the Children of the Forest. They would have just seen a terrible winter descend and linger far too long until spring magically returned to the world. Yet somehow, maybe from passing merchants, maybe in their fires, the Red Priests saw the truth. Now the truth is here again, for anyone to see. But the Maesters refuse. They debate and question and doubt, not to choose the wisest course, but because they're too used to doing nothing else. Most prophecies might be lies, but not all of them. The Long Night is coming. If we don't believe that, well, we won't need any prophecy to tell us our future.
In its time, the Dragon Pit was a marvel of the world. Full-grown Targaryen dragons nested beneath its massive dome, and even on the darkest nights, the walls seemed to glow with the fire of the great beasts inside.
As had the site's previous occupant, the Sept of Remembrance, when Maegor the Cruel blasted it with dragon fire during morning prayers. The screams of the dying men echoed through King's Landing all day, and a pall of ash and smoke hung over the city for a week.
But as it dissipated, so too did the rebellion of the Faith Militant. The Sept of Remembrance faded from memory, and Maegor decided to replace a monument to the gods with a monument to his family, the Dragon Pit.
Labor proved elusive, however, for after the Red Keep was finished, Maegor had hosted a 3-day feast for all the builders, stonemasons, and carpenters who had worked to build it. At its conclusion, he slaughtered them, so that only he would know the castle's secrets. So many men fled the construction of the Dragon Pit that Maegor was forced to employ the prisoners of the city dungeons, supplemented by skilled and ignorant builders from across the narrow sea.
For more than a century, the Targaryens housed their dragons in the Dragon Pit. But dragons are not horses to be stabled or hounds to be kenneled. With each generation, the dragons became less massive, less swift, less long-lived.
And less invulnerable. During the Dance of Dragons, 2 Targaryen factions killed a handful of their family's dragons while fighting each other. A frenzied mob even broke into the Dragon Pit and slaughtered the 5 dragons chained there, though the last managed to bring down the roof of the Great Dome on its assailants. The dragons never recovered their former strength or numbers. Perhaps their line had been too broken, or perhaps others intervened to break it further. But the last dragon grew no larger than a cat, and its death earned Aegon, 3rd of his name, the epithet Dragonbane.
What is a dragon pit without dragons? The roof remained where it had fallen. The great bronze doors rusted and fell off their hinges. Prostitutes cavorted where fantastic creatures had once fed and slept. Then came Daenerys. Now dragons once again darken the sky, but they will never darken the Dragon Pit again. Daenerys has learned the folly of chaining her dragons. The Dragon Pit is and will remain a ruin of a bygone age, when kings and queens flew high above their countrymen.
According to legend, a huntsman once tracked a lion that was terrorizing his village all the way to its den. Though armed with only a spear, the man managed to kill both the lion and its mate, but spared the cubs. This mercy so pleased the old gods that they sent a shaft of sunlight deep into the cave, gleaming off golden walls. The hunter became a miner and built a ring fort to guard his new wealth. Nobody ever asks what happened to the cubs. Maybe the gods forgot about them and they starved. Maybe there never were any cops, a lions, a hunter. Doesn't matter. Someone found enough gold in that cave to buy whatever truth he wanted, along with a castle that he'd name after his new family. Casterly Rock. Thanks to that gold, Casterly Rock soon became the largest, wealthiest, and best defended castle in Westeros. An army that struggled up the main approach would still have to climb thick, high, and well-defended walls. Should they choose instead to lay siege, the sea helpfully carved a massive cave beneath the castle, which over time became a private port complete with docks, wharves, and shipyards. And so, to this day, even with all the gold in Westeros to tempt invaders, Casterly Rock has never fallen. At least, not in battle. The castle is sadly all that remains of its namesake family, the Casterlys. According to another legend, my ancestor, Lan the Clever, swindled the castle from them. The most common story is that he found a hidden cleft in the rock and snuck into the castle. At night, he whispered threats into sleeping ears, howled in the darkness, planted one brother's treasures in the room of another, and so forth. By the end of his games, the Casterlys believed a demon was haunting their home and fled. My brother prefers a different version. Lan the Clever did find a secret entrance into the rock, but used it to have his way with the Casterly maidens. Eventually, the girls gave birth to golden-haired bastards, and the Casterlys had no choice but to accept their father into the family. In gratitude, he changed the family name to honor himself, and House Lannister was born. The Casterlys used the gold of the rock to become lords. The Lannisters became kings. For thousands of years, the Kingdom of the Rock ruled the Westerlands. When the Ironborn became a nuisance, my ancestors sailed to the Iron Islands and returned with 100 Ironborn hostages, promising to hang one from the rock every time the Ironborn dared raid our shores. The Ironborn stayed away, well, after 20 or so. When the Andals arrived after sweeping across the rest of Westeros, we invited their sons and daughters into the rock as squires and court ladies. I don't think we ever had to hang any of them. Finally, Aegon the Conqueror defeated us on the Field of Fire, and my ancestor knelt. Still, little changed but titles and taxes. For when Visenya Targaryen saw the rock, she gave thanks that my ancestor had met Aegon on the field. Even Dragonflame would have washed over the castle like the waves and left just as much a mark. But now the mines are dry, and Casterly Rock is just that, a rock. Our gold has passed into legend just like the merciful huntsman and Lan the Clever, as will our family if we lose this war. Unlike the Casterlys, however, we won't even have a castle to remember our name. When disciplining unruly vassals, most lords sent armies. My father Tywin only had to send a singer. There's no faster way to dull a vassal's ambition or any festive occasion than hearing the Rains of Castamere. The House Rain of Castamere was an old and proud house that was slowly sinking back into the muck. Their mines had run dry. Without gold, they turned to a more common source of wealth: daughters. Lady Ellen Rain was betrothed to my great-uncle, but when he fell in battle, Lady Ellen sought comfort in his twin brother's bed, beating out the other woman he promised to marry. Then the husband, who had shared his twin's wife, shared his twin's death on a different battlefield. Lady Ellen flung herself at the new, and married, heir to the rock. But my grandfather Titus was more kitten than lion. He ran away and told his wife of Lady Ellen's designs, and Lady Ellen soon found herself married off to Walderon Tarbeck, lord of another failing house. The Rains and Tarbecks should have sunk into obscurity together, and they would have if not for my grandfather becoming Lord of Casterly Rock. At first, the Westerlands laughed with the Laughing Lion, as the jovial Titus was called. But when men realized this lion had neither teeth nor claws, they started to laugh at him. None laughed harder than the Rains and Tarbecks. Though Lady Ellen was no longer welcome at Casterly Rock, Titus didn't refuse her brothers, Roger and Reynard Rain, not even when they asked for extravagant loans. Thanks to our family's gold, Lady Ellen restored Tarbeck Hall to a splendor she hadn't known since being cast out of our home. When my grandfather broached the subject of repayment, Roger and Reynard only laughed. And soon enough, my grandfather was laughing along with them. Then my father Tywin returned from the War of the Ninepenny Kings, where he'd seen how the rest of the realm sniggered at House Lannister. Determined to restore our proper place, my father demanded the immediate repayment of all debts to the Rock, or a hostage from those who couldn't pay. Reynard Rain merely laughed when he received the raven. Lord Walderon Tarbeck chose to ride to Casterly Rock, sure that he could cow Lord Titus into rescinding my father's commands. He could have, except it wasn't Titus who met him at the gates, but my father, who had Lord Walderon thrown into a dungeon. Lady Ellen protested. The Rains threatened war, and finally my grandfather broke and released Lord Tarbeck with an apology no less. As if bathing himself in shame, Titus further forgave all the Tarbeck debts to our house. To celebrate the end of hostilities, Lord Roger feasted Titus at Castamere, and the two lords proclaimed their friendship for eternity. My father allowed eternity to last a year. When he summoned the Rains and Tarbecks to Casterly Rock to answer for their crimes, they rose in revolt, exactly as he expected. Their defiance gave him a pretext to call his banners and ride for Tarbeck Hall and Castamere with an army behind him. He didn't even bother to inform my grandfather. My father's army descended on Tarbeck so quickly that Lord Walderon had no time to gather his forces and rode against my father with only his household knights. Soon, his head, his sons' heads, and the heads of any man with Tarbeck blood adorned the spears of the Lannister vanguard as it marched to Tarbeck Hall. At their approach, Lady Ellen Tarbeck closed her gates and sent ravens to her brothers at Castamere. She assumed they'd have more than enough time to muster their armies and break what would be a long siege. My father had trebuchets up in a day and brought down the keep within hours. Lady Ellen and her son were crushed in its fall. When the Tarbeck forces surrendered, my father put their castle to the torch. He arrived with his army just in time to see the flames consuming his sister's home. He charged my father's camp, hoping surprise would win out over my father's greater numbers. It didn't. With half his men dead on the field and a crossbolt in his back, Lord Roger fled back to Castamere. The Lannister host arrived at Castamere 3 days later. Like Castle Rock, the seat of House Rain had begun as a mine. When the gold gave out, the mine shafts were widened into halls, galleries, and bedchambers deep beneath the earth. The Rain brothers didn't have the men to defend the castle walls and retreated into their underground stronghold. From this relative safety, they offered terms to my father to avoid a long siege. My father didn't reply. Instead, he commanded that the mines be sealed with stone and soil until there was no way in and no way out. When that was completed, it took less than a day to dam the stream beside the castle and only 2 to divert it to the nearest mine entrance. The Rains had taken more than 300 men, women, and children into the mines. A few guards reported hearing faint screams and shouts below them one night, but come dawn, the earth was silent once again. And now the rain weeps over their halls, with no one left to hear.
What the king dreams, the hand of the king builds. Or, so say the kings, the hands, and the lords who wish to be hands. The lowborn put it differently. The king eats and the hand takes the shit. The fact is, most kings hate ruling. We shouldn't blame them. Their only qualification is blood. So, naturally they're wary of a seat made of blades. Far better to find other men to rule in their stead. But how should a king select his hand? Family? One king chose his brother, Prince Maegor, a warrior who was proud and arrogant. Maegor agreed to marry the High Septon's niece to unite the faith and the crown, but then secretly wed a second wife, in a Valyrian ceremony artfully combining bigamy and heresy. And when word of it got out, the king was forced to exile Maegor and choose a Septon as his new hand. But the damage had been done. The king had trusted in family, and his brother had set off a rebellion that would claim his rule and his life. Strength? As little more than a boy, Sir Criston Cole replaced the legendary Sir Rayam Redwyne on the King's Guard and soon rose to Lord Commander. But knights only know one way to settle disputes. When Prince Aegon's father died, Sir Criston slit the throat of an advisor who objected to Aegon's ascension over his aunt, the anointed heir. His actions so pleased the new king, Aegon, second of his name, that he appointed Sir Criston as his hand in the ensuing civil war, called the Dance of Dragons. Neither Sir Criston nor the king, nor even the Targaryen dragons would survive it. Perhaps it's no surprise that the wisest king in the history of Westeros made the wisest choice for his hand. The son of a lowly blacksmith, Septon Barth had few options for advancement in the world, and even fewer after his family gave him to the faith as a child. But as royal record keeper, Barth impressed the king so much that the king, defying all his high-born advisors, made Septon Barth his hand. 40 years of prosperity ensued. So much did Barth accomplish that many lords and commoners credited him with sorcery. No other explanation could they accept for a man without blood or skill at arms. Because what Barth had was rarer than both: a sharp mind. Years later, the realm had no sharper mind than Lord Tywin Lannister, hand to King Aerys Targaryen, or, as history remembers him, the Mad King. He saw assassins and plots in every shadow, heard whispers in silence, and burned men alive. But his greatest madness by far was driving away Lord Tywin. The Mad King then cycled through every mistake of his ancestors. Soldiers, toadying lords, and at the end even an alchemist, perhaps to save the crown's growing expenses on wildfire. Unfortunately, it didn't save his crown or his dynasty. The new King Robert chose his foster father, Lord John Arryn, as his hand. The wisest decision Robert ever made. Not that it had many rivals. Too bad it proved so fatal. Lord Arryn was a man of honor from an ancient and proud family. But honor is no shield against the corruption of the capital, as Lord Arryn's successor, Ned Stark, learned as well. Perhaps the hand of the king is a flawed idea. Westeros needs a ruler who can rule, who builds what he dreams himself. A king who can't govern his kingdom is no king, and a hand who shits what another man eats is an arse.
Tyrells claim Highgarden, but they didn't build it. They claim descent from the first king of the Reach, but only through the female line. The truth is that House Gardner built Highgarden when they ruled the Reach as kings, not lords. And as their name attests, they were the true heirs of Garth the Gardener, who founded their house and the kingdom, and brought law and order to the Reach. He built Highgarden as a fortress, not a pleasure palace. In those dark days, the Ironborn raided up and down the Mandar at will, and the Dornish were even more trouble than they are now. While enduring shame, a Dornish army once sacked Highgarden and destroyed the Oakenseat, the living throne of the Gardner kings planted by Garth Greenhand himself. The Gardeners responded wisely, sending armies of their own to pacify and defend the countryside. My ancestors at Horn Hill joined them, as did the other great families of the Reach. Even House Hightower yielded without a fight, choosing marriage into House Gardner over a war that would weaken us against outsiders. But the outsiders still came. The Andals swept across Westeros, destroying many ancient families and kingdoms. When the invaders arrived at the Reach, led by Sir Alistair Tyrell, House Gardner chose accommodation over battle, hoping honors and marriages would sate the foreigners' ambitions. The Tyrells were welcomed into service as hereditary stewards of Highgarden. Thousands of years later, they repaid the Gardeners for their acceptance. When Aegon Targaryen declared that Westeros was now his, King Mern IX allied with King Loren Lannister of the Westerlands. Together, they fought to save Westeros from another foreign barbarian, whose family practices put decent men to shame. But the dragons won, and the Field of Fire claimed Mern and all his sons, grandsons, and brothers. Instead of using the castle for what it was built to do, Harlan Tyrell surrendered it to Aegon without a fight. In exchange, Harlan was given the castle his family had served for thousands of years, with all its attendant lands and lords, including my family. Perhaps the Tyrells were great once, but Harlan gave away their honor when he opened gates that weren't his to open, and to a foreign invader. Ever since, there hasn't been a Lord Tyrell who wasn't a mockery of the title. Women rule that house. Everybody knows it. And look what it's wrought. Their proper lord, heir, and queen, dead, leaving only a shrunken old woman who forgets her loyalties to the realm either in grief or dotage. But her thorns won't protect her more than any other rose when the hand comes to rip them out.
King's Landing is both a city and a curse. Aegon the Conqueror was the first king to land there. His first conquest, a tiny village at the mouth of the Blackwater River, where he raised a wooden fort. When it became clear that Aegon would earn his title, people flocked to the fort and renamed it King's Landing in his honor. The ploy succeeded, and Aegon chose King's Landing for his capital over older and more beautiful cities like Old Town and anywhere else. The currying of royal favor thus became the foundation of the city, and blood its bricks. Maegor the Cruel, Aegon's son, completed the city's famous Red Keep to hold the trappings of power, the royal family, the King's Guard, and the Iron Throne. To maintain the new castle's secrets, Maegor murdered all its masons and craftsmen at a feast, which he catered with the new castle servants, who soon found all its secrets for themselves. When the Faith Militant challenged his rule, Maegor raised their sept of remembrance to the ground with them inside at prayer and erected the dragon pit on the ashes. But the great dragons it housed were attacked by the very low-born people they were meant to terrify. Thousands of people died in the attempt, but hundreds of thousands lived in King's Landing. And now the only dragons in the city are golden. Like most kings, Aegon and Maegor missed a central truth. That a king lands is less important than what he lands on. The people, who will never visit his Red Keep, or his Dragon Pit, or any of his noble monuments to nobility, because they're too busy holding up his realm. Without the slums of Flea Bottom and the poor and desperate folk it produces, who would fight the king's wars and cook the king's meals, and admire him as he rode past at speed? Without its winding dark alleys and pot shops, where would the Red Keep empty its sewage? Of all kinds. Without the Street of Flour, the king would have no bread. Without the Street of Steel, the king's armies would have no swords, armor, or victories. Without the Street of Looms, the king would go naked. And without the Street of Silk, he wouldn't enjoy it. Without the Street of Sisters, the king would have no humility. It leads from the ruin of the Dragon Pit to the ruin of the great Sept of Baelor, where the Targaryens and Baratheons buried their kings, until Cersei Lannister unburied them. Now those kings are ashes, scattered on the wind, and nobody marked where they landed. A palace without people is a tomb. A realm without people is scenery.
It should not be hard to recruit lords into a war against an enemy known as the Mad King. We can even understand the lords who chose to honor their oaths and fight for him. But the Krakens of House Greyjoy set out Robert's rebellion on Pike with their tentacles up their arse.
My father Quellon was old, and sitting is what old people do best. Well, second best. He would have sat out the whole war, if not for my brother and me. We convinced him that nobody would fear the walls of the sea if we curled up by our fires while others feasted on the spoils of the Mad King. So the old man creaked into his rusty armor and set sail for the Reach, only to be routed by Tyrell longboats. When my father sadly fell in battle, my older brother Balon beat a tactical retreat to his own inheritance as the new lord of the Iron Islands.
I'd rather die in the Reach than live on the Iron Islands.
The roses are prettier to pluck. But my brother was getting old and felt that longing to sit. And the sea stone chair was as good a place as any. Within a few years, he realized that sitting is only fun if everyone else has to stand. He had the priest reforge. No, that's not right. They picked up sticks on the beach, wove them into a new ancient driftwood crown, and declared Balon the king of the Iron Islands. Unfortunately for my brother, the other king in Westeros, Robert Baratheon, was famously bad at sharing, and his father by law and warden of the West, Tywin Lannister, had a mighty fleet at Lannisport within striking distance of the Iron Islands.
Yes, you were very clever, and how brave, burning our ships at anchor in the night.
They would have burned the same in daylight. Iron's a lazy beast. You didn't rouse until long after I set fire to your proud mane. I planned it all, you know. My first torch took your father's flagship. If it makes you feel better, we didn't loot it. Out of respect. And time.
I don't think I ever saw Robert happier than the day he heard about the Greyjoy Rebellion. He'd been king for a handful of years, and many handfuls of other things, and it was clear to him and everyone else how ill-suited he was to rule. But battle he could do. Unfortunately, by the time we raised our army, we seemed to be winning the war. Balon's eldest son, your nephew, died trying to storm Seaguard, and his men were thrown back into the arms of their drowned god. If we wanted battle, we'd have to hurry north before the Ironborn put down their own rebellion.
And we would have, if I've had my way. Rebelling was a stupid idea.
Never stopped your people before.
Before Balin put those sticks on his head, I told him that if he wanted to rule the Iron Islands, all he had to do was give King Robert a tour of them. Why waste our forces fighting a war we couldn't win for a place our enemy wouldn't want? With the Iron Fleet, we could reef not just Westeros, but the rich lands beyond the Sunset Sea. But my brother was too attached to that Seastone chair. He commanded me to sail the Iron Fleet against Robert's navy before we could ferry his army to Pike.
A navy commanded by Robert's younger brother, Stannis, most known for sitting in a besieged castle eating dogs and horses. Remind me, how did you fare against a man who'd never commanded ships in battle?
Nearly too well.
Stannis smashed your Iron Fleet at Fair Isle.
After I sailed it into a strait, where our numbers and the size of our ships would work against us. It took some doing to convince my men to rush into such an obvious trap. Stannis was not a subtle man.
You would rather claim treason than defeat.
Victory would have only delayed it. We couldn't hold off Robert's forces forever, but we could waste enough Ironborn that we wouldn't even fill our own islands after the war. I made sure the Silence escaped. That was enough for me. That, and watching your army smash my brother's castle soon afterwards.
Why didn't you just abandon him after Fair Isle? Why risk your precious life fighting for him at Pike?
I wanted to kill the best knights in Westeros.
You failed.
So did you. I expected pursuit when I fled Pike on the Silence. But I suppose you were too busy not punishing my brother to not punish the man who burned your father's fleet. And now, I'm back.
You were back. But what is the King of the Iron Islands when he's off the Iron Islands?
I'll never see those shit-stained rocks again. But I'm getting old, and I find myself wanting to sit down, as my father and brother did in their time. They just chose the wrong chair.
Fourth of his name, is remembered by history as the Unworthy. Quite a feat considering the other kings of Westeros. But even in a family not known for equanimity, Aegon stands out for spiteful incompetence. He tore apart the realm simply because he couldn't rule himself, much less Westeros. As a young prince, Aegon's wit made him beloved at court and won him forgiveness for youthful indiscretions. But the cold steel of the Iron Throne didn't temper his passions. King Aegon proclaimed that if he had to spend his days being pricked by 1,000 swords, he'd spend his nights pricking others with his one. Lords sent their daughters from court so they would not catch the king's eye, whilst other lords summoned their daughters to court, so they would. The only woman in whom he took no pleasure was his sister and wife, Nerys, even after she gave him a son and heir, Daeron. Perhaps Aegon was jealous of her supposed love for his brother, the legendary hero Prince Aemon, the Dragon Knight. Aegon was most certainly jealous of him, not of his bravery or honor, but how young maidens swooned and old whores cried at the songs about him. But most likely Aegon disregarded his wife and son because he chafed at restraints of any kind, be they the bonds of marriage, or patrimony, or even reason. When Prince Daeron objected to his father's foolish plan to invade Dorne, Aegon incited a lickspittle lord to accuse the queen of adultery with Aemon, making Daeron illegitimate. Prince Aemon defended the queen's honor in trial by combat. But while the lord's claim publicly died with him, no sword can kill a rumor. Out of spite and pique, Aegon had seeded doubt into his own heir's claim to the throne, which bore bitter fruit with the birth of another son, the bastard Daemon Waters, by the king's own cousin. Raised in the Red Keep on account of his mother's royal blood, Daemon grew tall and powerful, and excelled at all the martial skills that men wrongly value in leaders. Instead of protecting his own heir from a rival, Aegon knighted Daemon at 12, and shocked the realm by bestowing on him the Conqueror's own Valyrian steel sword. He even let the boy renounce his common bastard's name and take the Targaryen sword's name for his own, becoming Daemon Blackfire. Still, though a name can change, blood can't. And Daeron was Aegon's only true-born son, until he wasn't. On his deathbed, Aegon forever earned his epithet by legitimizing all his bastards, from the base-born sons of whores to the great bastards of noble ladies, including Daemon. Fittingly, Aegon's last act was to thrust himself into the realm and seed chaos. A Targaryen without self-restraint may have led Westeros to the brink of ruin, but the Highborn pushed it over. Though Daeron governed justly and wisely, correcting the worst excesses of his father's rule, many lords had grown rich off these excesses and did not approve of Daeron's reforms, particularly the peace he struck with Dorne. The malcontents rallied to Daemon and whispered that he should be king instead of his brother, whom, thanks to Aegon, many suspected was a bastard. At first, Daemon indulged these lords out of courtesy and vanity, but over time their grievances and flattery wore down his objections, along with any sense of obligation to the half-brother who had granted him lands and a wife. Daemon agreed to claim the throne by right of birth, and more importantly, arms. A wheel with two hubs will not turn, and a kingdom with two kings will burn, as the saying goes. Not that such a cost ever stopped anyone with even the remotest claim and opportunity, much less House Blackfire. Their rebellions consumed tens of years and thousands of lives. First Daemon's own, then his son, Daemon II, who reigned for a night. Then another son, Haegon, crowned by Bittersteel, another legitimized great bastard who had founded the Golden Company to support the Blackfire claim. When Haegon was executed, Bittersteel crowned Haegon's eldest son, Daemon III, who in turn was slain by their Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Sir Duncan the Tall. Finally, Meleys the Monstrous fell to Sir Barristan Selmy in the War of the Ninepenny Kings, and the Blackfire Rebellion ended with the extinction of the entire line, as is appropriate. Fire is only black when it is burned to ash. Perhaps that was the true problem with the Targaryens. The blood of the dragon runs hot, and fire consumes. Perhaps what Westeros needs is a ruler born not from fire, but from snow.
For thousands of years, when my people looked south, they saw only a wall of ice where lonely crows perched. The Kneelers had stolen our horizon, when our tools shattered against frozen rock, or our boats capsized in rough seas, or bears and shadow cats snatched our game. We cursed the soft men of the green lands beyond the wall. We cursed, and we envied. Huddled around our fires, we told tales of how the Southerners lived, how their stone houses touched the clouds and their bellies touched the ground, how their women fainted at the sight of blood and wouldn't knife a man even when he slept, how they wouldn't miss a few swords or rings or daughters. But now we've seen the real South, and we have to admit, we're disappointed. Southerners live life bent over, in the fields, in courts, in bed. They drink too little beer and they eat too many plants. In the North, a man's worth is in his hands and his stories, not his fancy name and fancy talk. With good steel, a man can hunt, kill, and live. What can a man do with gold, except shine? But what should I expect from a people who all want to sit on the iron chair? A waste of good metal. You can make better seats, I've used them. How am I supposed to get comfortable on a bunch of swords? Ah, now I see why all your queens are fighting over it. Maybe your southern asses are soft enough to take it, but give me a proper seat any day. Or a proper southern ass. As long as it isn't in the south. From what I hear, King's Landing is even hotter and madder than Winterfell. Full of oath breakers, rich shits, and tiny women. They'll kneel to anyone with an army, or gold, or special blood. Nobody can tell me if it's more red, or less red, or what. Maybe it's purple.
If the Dragon Queen wants a bunch of kneelers to be stomping along after her, she can have them. But my people have had enough. The dead are gone from the north, but the south is full of them. You just can't tell the difference.
Though the Targaryens had forged the Seven Kingdoms in fire and blood, they didn't govern with them. Until they did. Maegor, first of his name, defined council as confirmation and disagreement as treason. 3 Grand Maesters tried to avert disaster. Instead of taking their advice, Maegor took their heads. As a second son and exile, Maegor was never meant to rule. But no sooner did Maegor hear of his brother's death than he flew Balerion to Dragonstone and demanded the crown. Only the Grand Maester dared object that the throne should pass to his older brother's firstborn son, Prince Aegon. Maegor insisted that the Iron Throne should go to the man with the strength to seize it, and beheaded the Grand Maester. Prince Aegon soon took him at his word. He claimed his father's dragon, raised a host of Westermen, and marched on King's Landing while Maegor was in Old Town. Far from the capital, Maegor couldn't rally an army to match Aegon's. So he ordered his banners to swarm Aegon's larger army from all sides, confusing the young prince and slowing his advance. Beneath the god's eye, Maegor's disparate forces came together and attacked Aegon as Maegor himself swooped down from the clouds. For the first time since the doom of Valyria, dragon fought dragon in the sky. But Aegon's dragon was no match for Balerion the Dread, who was 4 times its size. When Aegon fell to his death, his army broke and fled. For slaying his own nephew, Maegor forever after became known as the Cruel, though of course, not to his face. The next Grand Maester dared object to Maegor taking a 3rd wife, when taking his 2nd wife had ruined his brother's reign, because Maegor's 1st wife was the niece of the High Septon. But Maegor beheaded the Grand Maester and declared war on the Faith. He set fire to the Riverlands, the Westerlands, and the Reach in a campaign to root out disloyal lords, and sponsored a more pliant High Septon. None of it worked. Maegor may have returned to the capital with 2,000 skulls of the Faith militant, but most of them weren't soldiers. They were simple folk who had sheltered the outlaw Septons, or turned out in droves to hear them denounce the wicked king. The 3rd Grand Maester dared to declare Maegor the father of his own heir. But when his 2nd wife miscarried, and Maegor saw the monstrous stillbirth, Maegor beheaded the Grand Maester for his insolent adherence to truth. So he had no one to warn him when his 3rd wife, sensing an advantage, declared that his 2nd wife had been unfaithful, and produced a list of potential fathers of the misshapen child. Not only did Maegor execute his 2nd wife and her father, his own Hand of the King, but he also marched on her family's castle and slaughtered everyone who bore a drop of her family's blood. But his 3rd wife couldn't give him a child either. Desperate to cement his stolen throne with an heir, Maegor took 3 wives at once, known as the Black Brides because each were women he'd widowed in his wars. All 3 women grew full with child in time, but each gave birth to the same twisted monstrosities as his 2nd wife. One need not be a maester, much less a Grand Maester, to deduce the common thread here. Though Maegor stamped out the fires of rebellion, his cruelty and fear only scattered more tinder over the realm until even the smallest ember could set the realm alight. One day, the Faith militant emerged from the shadows, and the lords sent to quash it joined it instead. His Hand resigned and retired to his island home. Finally, House Baratheon declared for Maegor's own nephew as the rightful king. The Lannisters, Tyrells, and Arryns soon joined, adding more than half the might of Westeros to the prince and his 2 dragons, which became 3 when Maegor's niece and involuntary Black Bride stole away from the Red Keep with her dragon. Her treason wasn't even the last. Maegor's own Lord Admiral sailed the royal fleet into his nephew's harbor, but most fitting of all, when Maegor tried to send ravens to call his banners, he found that his 4th Grand Maester had learned from his predecessors and fled. Maegor spent one final night on the Iron Throne. He was found in the morning, with his wrists slashed and one of the throne's blades jutting from his throat. Nobody knows if it was one of his queens, or Kingsguard, or one of the thousands who wanted him dead, or even Maegor himself, frustrated that his body had failed his will. Whoever the culprit, no doubt he died as all tyrants do, believing that history would vindicate him. It hasn't. History may be written with fire and blood, but histories aren't. As any good advisor could have warned him. The coin of Ares, second of his name, had landed on madness. But half the coins of the Targaryens had landed so. Yet only Ares would be known as the Mad King, thanks in no small part to the defiance of Duskendale. Duskendale was the greatest port on Blackwater Bay until Aegon built King's Landing. As the capital grew richer and more prosperous, it sucked ships and gold away from Duskendale. To halt its long decline, the Lord of Duskendale, Sir Dennis Darklyn, petitioned King Aerys for a royal charter that would allow him to levy his own port fees and taxes, which would obviously be lower than in King's Landing. The Hand of the King, Tywin Lannister, refused. But, knowing of the tension between the Hand and its king, Sir Dennis invited the king to Duskendale to evaluate his petition himself rather than deferring to his Hand. When Tywin admonished the king to refuse, as any sensible advisor would, a petulant and bristling Aerys instead accepted, traveling to Duskendale with a small retinue and only one of his Kingsguard. As soon as Aerys stepped within the city, Sir Dennis seized him, killing the Kingsguard and the few others who dared defend their king. Aerys was hauled to the dungeons to have his beard pulled, and have other petty cruelties inflicted on his royal person. Lord Tywin immediately raised an army and marched on Duskendale, but Sir Dennis threatened to kill the king at the first signs of an assault. If Sir Dennis hoped to force Tywin to offer terms, he didn't know Lord Tywin, who refused to even parley until Sir Dennis released the king and surrendered. The royal army surrounded the city, and the royal navy blockaded it. Sir Dennis had clearly not anticipated such obstinacy, nor that the king's Hand would be in no rush to save the maddening king, when, as Lord Tywin himself pointed out, the realm had a better option in the king's much more stable son, Prince Rhaegar. After 6 months, Lord Tywin's patience was at an end. Or at least, none could claim he acted recklessly if he now stormed the city and Sir Dennis killed the king. But the dutiful and honorable Sir Barristan the Bold volunteered to infiltrate the city and rescue his king single-handedly, as befit his Kingsguard oath. Tywin couldn't refuse such valor, publicly, and so begrudged Sir Barristan one night. Then he would storm the city and put every man, woman, and child to the sword. With only his hands, Sir Barristan climbed the city walls in the dark of night and snuck through the city disguised as a beggar, evading patrols and suspicious townspeople. When he reached the walls of the city keep, the Dun Fort, he scaled those by hand as well, even dispatching the wall guard before he could sound an alarm. With incredible bravery and luck, Sir Barristan made his way to the dungeons and freed his king. Then Sir Barristan's luck ran out. A cry went up through the castle. Someone had discovered the king was gone. With horns and trumpets blaring an alarm, Sir Barristan cut their way to the stables, avenging his slain Kingsguard brother, but taking an arrow to his chest. Slipping through the castle gate just as it closed, the wounded Sir Barristan and Aerys rode through the roused town, racing for the city walls and beyond it the safety of the royal army. Lord Tywin's archers raced forward to clear the walls of defenders, and Sir Barristan the Bold earned immortality by delivering King Aerys to the waiting, if not welcoming, arms of his Hand. Without his hostage, Sir Dennis surrendered and begged mercy from the same king he'd imprisoned. Most men would have had none. Aerys had less. He commanded Sir Dennis to be executed along with any man, woman, or child who bore his family name, and anyone who once had. As for Sir Dennis's foreign wife, who had urged his defiance, Ares commanded that her tongue and womanly parts be torn out, and she be burned alive. It was his first time passing such a sentence. It must have given him a taste for it. For the king rescued from Duskendale was not the same king who'd entered it. Many men would crack after 6 months in a dark cell, being mocked, prodded, and tweaked. Ares had arrived cracked. Now he was shattered. For years he would refuse to leave the Red Keep, encouraged no doubt by his worried advisors, since he also refused to allow any blades near his person, even to shave his beard, cut his hair, and trim his nails. He began to see enemies in every shadow, who vanished only when the fires burned.